Okay, I think we'll make a start. So welcome to this session on climate smart management of UK seas. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation up on the screen now. Just let everybody know that we are going to be recording this session, and we'd like to request that until the Q&A session at the end, if you could turn your cameras and microphones off at this stage, that would be much appreciated. We are going to save all the questions until we have that dedicated session towards the end. But if there are questions that pop into your mind as we're going through the various presentations that we're going to have today, please do put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we pick those up later. But there will also be the opportunity when we get to that Q&A session later, if you want to just raise your hand or put some questions in at that time as well. So I'm going to hand over at this stage to the chair of the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership, who is Matt Frost. So yeah, welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Paul, and yeah, and welcome everybody. It's really exciting to see so many people here for this webinar. There's this webinar is going to present work which goes right across lots of sectors, lots of geographic areas, involves a lot of people, academia, policy, industry. So it's really exciting that we've got to this where we're able to present this overview. We're really looking forward to this session. Paul, can I have the first slide, please? Thank you. So just to very quickly say how this is going to run. So I will give a very brief introduction. So I'm Matt Frost. So I chair the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership, but actually I'm kind of a link in the jigsaw here because I'm also head of the international office at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, where most of this work was led from. So and you'll be hearing from Anna shortly. So just for those, many of you will know about MSPACE, many of you will have been involved in MSPACE, but I just want to very briefly introduce those who don't know to MCCIP and our role in this. So Paul, if you want to go to the next, yeah, thank you. So the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership has been running for many years. In fact, we're talking next year about having a 20 years of MCCIP celebration. And we've always sat in what is now very trendily referred to as the science policy interface. But when we started, it was just trying to get science into policy to inform it, those involved in management and making decisions, even those drafting legislation, bringing all of the evidence together on marine climate change to feed in via sort of things like this, webinars, reports, and other things that we do. And there's a big focus now on really how we adapt and mitigate in terms of climate change. And I think MSPACE for us is, we were very excited about getting involved with PML on this project to begin with, because it's a really excellent example of solutions and tools that we can develop in order to move forward with climate. Next slide, please, Paul. So just to let you know how this is going to work, I'm going to hand over shortly to Anna Kiros, who's the PI on this project, and she's going to present the key findings and an overview of this work. And then we're going to hear then from a couple other people who've been involved in applying this. So Shah McGuinness from the MMO, and then Hugh Edwards from DARA. As Paul said, as we go along, please post questions in the chat, and then we're going to have a Q&A session for the last 15-20 minutes or so, where we'll both go through the questions that have been posted, but also there may be time for you to stick your hand up at that point. Next slide, please, Paul. So just very quickly, just to say, you'll be hearing, the talks in the next few minutes or next hour or so, but you can go onto the MCCIP website, and I invite you all to do so, where you can download the technical report, which is the detailed information, but there's also a summary for policymakers. There's an infographic which sums it all up, which is the one that we put on screen when you logged in, and there are some annexes with a lot of data. All of this information is freely available for everybody. So I think the link's been posted in the chat, so please feel free to go ahead and you can access this infographic and other things. Okay, I'm going to stop there because, as I said, I'm sure many of you are familiar with MCCIP and you are more keen to hear now on this work. So I'm going to hand over to Anna Kiros from Plymouth Marine Laboratory to introduce and give an overview of the MSPACE work. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Matt, for this lovely introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming on your lunch breaks. We really appreciate it. This is the launch of the early warning system, which is a report which hopes to help move forward the ability of the UK nations to do climate smart spatial management. And so if you're here, you're probably quite familiar with marine climate change, and particularly in our UK seas. And so you know that marine climate change involves really important physical, biogeochemical, and food web changes to our marine environment. And these in turn have quite important consequences for the ways in which we are able to deliver effective conservation of wild ecosystems through, for example, biodiversity changes, arrival of species, loss of important species, and potentially the loss of efficacy of our designated sites. It also has important consequences for fisheries, for example, through the loss of catch in previously very productive areas for the sector, through stock migration and the arrival of new species in our waters, and also for the management of aquaculture, for example, through the reduced predictability of spat collection events, which are so important in terms of keeping going our businesses around our coasts. And because of those changes and because of those impacts, the language of climate change is very well embedded into the UK marine planning policy. So for those of you unfamiliar, marine plans are policy instruments that document where marine activities are distributed at present and set out or help set out priorities for the way in which we manage that space, how different objectives of environmental, social, and economic relevance are balanced in those decisions. And so, for instance, if you look at the plans for our UK nations, so noting that marine planning is by and large a devolved responsibility across the UK, you will find frequently the language of reducing vulnerability in coastal and marine areas, building resilience and preparing for climate change with a view to increase the resilience of people, places, and the environment to these effects. Now, when we started this journey of MSPACE, so the Marine Spatial Planning Addressing Climate Effects project a few years back, we found that, or we agreed that in order to deal with those impacts, we probably need to know about where are the sensitive areas in our marine space and where are those that are resilient to climate change. So the sensitive areas are areas that we typically refer to as climate change hotspots, so those that will change very significantly as climate change unfolds across our coasts and our seas into the coming decades, relative to those that are perhaps more resilient, where the pace of change is slower. And so having that knowledge probably helps us make decisions about where, for instance, to prioritize conservation in one area, or perhaps allow for the exploration of that area, particularly by different types of sectors with different degrees of impact in the marine environment. And so what planners and the people drawing up marine plans and those that advise them, what they probably want to know is about what type of no regrets decisions can be made about the allocation of marine space that increase that resilience of nature and people to climate change. So they probably want to know what decisions can be made in terms of marine space that accommodate those changes or that will be effective regardless of those changes. But what we found when we put together this project at the beginning a few years back was that there are a few capability gaps that were slowing the pace through which that evidence was being not taken up in the planning process. And the first important one was that marine plans and associated policies, whilst having that language, that aspirational language to deliver that climate action, they did not provide explicit guidance on how to assess or manage the potential impacts of marine activities on that spatial distribution of climate resilience of species and habitats, and so how that variable sensitivity of species and habitats to climate change might be affected by activities that are then considered within planning and licensing. Another important capability gap we found was that the processes informing the designation of conservation sites did also not take into account that climate-driven redistribution of species and habitats, and that seems particularly important in the context of a sustainable use of the marine environment. And the third capability we identified was that there was at the time no procedural guidance on how that spatial evidence on the climate-driven redistribution of species of interest to both fisheries and aquaculture sectors could be taken into account in their spatial management. And so, because of that, we came together as a group of natural and social scientists and economists distributed across the UK nations, colleagues in industry, and indeed several colleagues in the policy agencies that have, or the agencies that have statutory responsibility with the preparation of marine plans across the UK, with the idea to deliver this project, MSPACE, which aims to inform and the design and implementation of climate-smart plans across the UK nations, which are also economically viable and socially acceptable. So we look at the UK marine space from the point of view of the EEZ, so the whole of the UK seas, and then we take a specific focus within the nations because planning is a devolved process. And so with then a particular focus within that in these three sectors, we hope to inform the design and review of the marine plans, help DEFRA with this marine spatial prioritization program, which is setting out the longer-term trajectory for marine planning across the UK, and with that help inform associated policy mechanisms that affect the way with which we plan and make decisions about marine space into the future. And so as part of that process, we created the early warning system, which in essence takes into account the most advanced climate modeling we had for the marine environment across the UK when we started the project, and tries to help make that transition from having the evidence into actionable planning policy that is adaptive and addresses the effects of climate change in the marine environment. And the methodology for that is that we take the evidence and all of the sources of the data used in this work can be found in the report, which we'll come to in a minute. And so we take that evidence and we look at the modeling data sets that could be used to best represent the environment and the species of interest to each of those three focal sectors, so the fisheries, aquaculture, conservation. We apply a very specific climate modeling analysis approach, which is used, for example, by the IPCC, called climate signal detection, which allows us to then classify the various areas of the marine environment into these three categories. So the climate change refugia, where the ecosystem remains more or less within the bounds of what we see now. So, for example, where if you have a protected area, you might expect to see more or less the same species and habitats into the coming decades. We identify the climate change hotspots, so the opposite, the very sensitive areas where we see very strong changes consistent with long-term climate change trends, and the bright spots, occasional areas, temporary areas where you might see an improvement of habitats, which might be important in the short and in the medium-term management of marine space. And so with that classification, we are able to build these sectorial climate resilience maps. So we run these analyses on the climate modeling focused on specific subsectors within those sectors. And we consider every possible period from the present until the end of the century and various greenhouse gas emissions trajectories. And then we overlay into that analysis a wealth of information that allows us to represent the current structure of our blue economy. So in essence, all of the marine sectors, where they are now and where we think they're going to grow into the future. And with that information, so the climate change evidence and the sectorial data, we are able to look into within and cross-sector interactions, as well as the effects of climate change on those interactions. And with this work, we then develop scenarios with our participating policy and industry colleagues about indeed what no regrets spatial decisions could be made based on that evidence. And that in essence represents the basis of the climate ready spatial advice that the project makes. And so the early warning system is this composite of reports and data that can now be found using that QR code, which is hosted in the MCCIP website, as Matt very kindly referred to earlier, which includes an infographic, which is really a first entry point into the sort of a very detailed analysis of the progression of climate change in the UK coasts and seas. It includes a summary for policymakers, which adds a bit more detail, a bit more meat on the bone to that very general introduction. And then indeed you can find the early warning system report and data, which are then the technical exploration and analysis of that climate change evidence. And so the early warning system looks at the whole UK EZ from the point of view of planning, so taking into account all of the sectors that compose our blue economy, but focuses particularly on those three sectors: conservation, fisheries, and aquaculture within that lens. And I'd like to acknowledge all of the contributions of our authors that are really a combination of academics, industry, and policy, really towards the elaboration of this report. And what you can look at if you look at the report is you can find these types of animations which are produced for each sector, and each frame in these GIFs is actually a 20-year period, and the contrasting analysis, an analysis that contrasts that period, which you can see moving forward in time in the bottom left there. So those 20-year periods in contrast to the present, and the color of those symbols essentially determines the sensitivity of that area to climate change. And we have quite complex analysis, called quite an in-depth dive into that progression. Then there is a more of a summary way of looking at it, into the sort of the aggregation of those effects over time, and we locate the presence of those refuges, so the areas that are seen to be more resilient to climate change, or that indeed remain within the boundaries of what we find at present. They are all identified, and they are placed in relation to the corresponding marine planning instrument, so that within which that area falls, and we then highlight also what activities occur within that zone that could affect the use of that area as a refuge for that particular sector into the future. All of the information is then condensed into these summary maps, which I will give you a bit more detail about, which in essence provide you with these colored regions which identify the refugia and the hotspots for these particular sectors and subsectors within them. And all of the information generated or used to generate those maps, the shape files, that is also all made publicly available through the report, which is hosted on the MCCIP website. And so the types of information that we can draw are, from a very sort of high level, you can look at, for example, the delivery of our 30 by 30 commitments, so our commitment to protect 30% of our waters into the future. And you can see that if we look at different types of species and habitats, it's very unlikely that we would be able to deliver that, particularly under high emissions, so RCP 8.5, so more or less a 4-degree world, 3 to 4 degree world, so the most extreme level of emissions. And you can see that a more moderate future where we hit perhaps 2 degrees of warming might provide a better way to deliver on those sorts of high level sustainability goals for our marine environment. And indeed, if we look at the location of the areas that are sensitive to climate change, so those climate change hotspots where we see the emergence of trends that are consistent with long-term climate change into the future, and if we drill into the different sectors we looked at specifically in the report, you can see that by and large many of those areas are very extensive and cover many areas of the UK, and of course many of our marine planning mechanisms. However, there are also opportunities to capitalize on where those species and habitats are more resilient to climate change, and so particularly those climate change refugia, which were found to be fairly extensive, for example, for pelagic fisheries or the delivery of climate services by seabed habitats. And so what we can do with this evidence, what we are doing is, what those summary maps convey is take into account the very complex nature of climate change evidence. So you can see here, for example, for pelagic fisheries, so the summary map there on the left, and then the analysis underpinning the creation of that map here in the middle. So that's RCP 4.5, so a 2-degree world, and 8.5, so a 3 to 4 degree world on the right. And you can see that very clearly that, for example, looking at the sensitivity, so the purple triangles emerging in the maps, you can see that for pelagic fisheries, changes are much more widespread and come much faster under a higher emissions world than in a lower emissions world. But more importantly, what we can see is that there are indeed extensive areas where action can be taken and where the activity of these sectors might be less affected by climate change. And taking that information into account might be important, for example, in the drawing up of plans where we're thinking about, the expansion of our renewable sector, the extraction of oil and gas, which hopefully won't be very much, but particularly for, renewable expansion, or indeed the siting of protected areas. Where can we get the most benefit from the location of these sites into the future as climate change unfolds? And so what we are doing with this evidence now is working with our colleagues in policy, which have that statutory responsibility for the drawing up of these plans, and using that evidence to help develop potential spatial management scenarios that allow them to make those no-regret decisions about these particular sectors. So taking that climate evidence to build the way in which spatial management might be done into the future. And that information doesn't end with the project. So what we are doing is creating a means for that information to be considered alongside how people actually value these systems in these particular planning areas, and the economic consequences of taking those climate adaptive decisions with regard to the management of marine space. And that's the MSPACE tool that is coming by the end of summer 2025. So I just wanted to leave a last word about, with regards to the use of climate modeling. We know that there is a lot of uncertainty that can be hard to grapple with when we're drawing a policy where we need certainty. And so taking the MCCIP approach, we've taken a lot of effort into creating a model validation annex that goes with the report that allows for a very clear identification of the evidence for which we have fair certainty, or where the models are representing real life observations with skill, and where they are not and why they are not. Comes with Annex 1, and that's all downloadable as well with the report, as well as Annex 2, which looks at the physical condition of our seabed habitats and the impact of various physical pressures, namely fisheries and aggregate extraction. And that evidence, which is in Annex 2, is also used in the recommendations that are made in the report, so that the recommendations are actually a cumulative assessment of climate and human activities in the marine environment. And so the key messages from the report really are that indeed spatially explicit strategies are needed to address the effects of climate change through marine planning and other spatial management mechanisms in the UK, and that the identified marine climate change refuge that we identify in these reports could be used as part of those strategies, particularly by focusing on sites that exhibit natural climate change resilience. However, the flip side of that is that areas identified as climate change hotspots could perhaps help identify where support for nature and people might be most important as climate change unfolds in the coming decades, and that the impacts we see arrive earlier and are more widespread than anticipated, particularly under high emission scenarios, and that indeed strong curbs to greenhouse gas emissions still represent the best hope for our UK seas. Thanks very much for your time. Hope to just direct you to the report link there. And yes, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Anna. That was a fantastic overview, and I mean, it's such an exciting piece of work, and I think what we're going to hear now is the application. So we're going to hear a user perspective now on how this can be used, and can I just say, just to remind everybody, please put comments and questions into the chat as we go along. There will be a time for Q&A after this, but I'm now going to hand over to Sian McGuinness, who's Senior Marine Planner at the MMO. So Sian, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks Anna, and thanks for having me today. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the East Marine Plan and the MSPACE outputs and how we're hoping to incorporate the MSPACE outputs in the replacement East Marine Plan. So please can I have the next slide? Great, thank you. So the MMO is currently in the process of replacing the East Marine Plan. The recommendation to replace the East Marine Plan was accepted by the Secretary of State due to substantial context changes that have taken place since the plan was published in 2014. So in the third three-year report for the East Marine Plan, it was identified that introduced strategies for energy security and meeting net zero also added to the change in context, so the British Energy Security Strategy and the Net Zero Strategy. The context change combined with the unprecedented impact of climate change means that the MMO is currently looking to make the second generation of marine planning in England more climate smart and more spatially prescriptive. Part of the making of the plans more climate smart will include the incorporation and use of climate related modelling, tools to assess current and future spatial and temporal changes in the use of the East Marine Plan areas and the ecosystems, goods and services. So the MSPACE Early Warning Systems report will feed into this, but we're also looking to be working with MSPACE on their East Marine Plan case study, which Anna touched on before in the last presentation, and this will form part of MSPACE is deliverable 4, I believe. So I must emphasise that this is the very start of incorporating the early warning system outputs into the plan, and we're currently we'll be embarking on the issues and supporting evidence phase of the replacement East Marine Plan process, and that will also help serve to identify what marine planning in England can address from the issues raised within the early warning systems report. However, the next few slides are some initial thoughts. So please could I have the next slide? Thank you. So as we've heard, the report looks at climate change, refugia and hotspots for 3 sectors of marine conservation, fisheries and aquaculture. And as you can see by the figures on screen, so right is the refugia and left is the hotspots. In the East Marine Plan areas, refugia identified in the East Marine Plan areas is mainly for pelagic fisheries, but there's also some refugia for climate services, although the report currently states a fairly low degree of certainty due to the difficulties of predicting carbon sequestration. And then there's also hotspots found for most of the other sectors, to be honest. So a bit of pelagic fisheries in the north of the offshore East Marine Plan areas, and then also hotspots for pelagic, for megafauna that rely on pelagic and benthic habitats, pelagic and benthic habitats themselves, and also aquaculture. So one of the key things that the MMO will be asking is what we do with these refugia and hotspots. So some examples could be, are we looking to safeguard refugia? Are we looking to prioritise reducing other pressures in refugia? Or actually, would we prioritise looking at reducing pressures in hotspots, for example, if these are going to be adversely impacted by climate change? And then also, as Anna mentioned, do we encourage potentially other activities to take place where hotspots are, as they might not be suitable for use kind of in the upcoming years? So these are just some of the questions that we're hoping that the East Marine Plan case study will help us to ask and also solve moving forward. Please can I have the next slide? Thank you. So just a little look at each sector individually. So the East Marine Plan areas have been identified as harbouring climate resilient pelagic fisheries in the long term with a high agreement between RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 emission scenarios. So it's well known that the East Marine Plan area is very busy with many activities jostling for space. Therefore, we would be looking in the future to combine the outputs of the MSPACE Early Warning Systems report with other work across government, such as the Marine Spatial Prioritisation Programme. There's also the opportunity to overlay the climate modelling with some of the habitat modelling that has recently been conducted, and also some of the MMO's more recent mapping of where under 12 fishing vessels are fishing in the marine areas. I must highlight that marine planning in English kind of marine waters does not set fisheries management measures. However, the marine plan policies could be developed to highlight spatially highlight areas that are climate resilient and to support fishing activities in those areas. And others' ideas may be safeguarding important areas for pelagic fisheries or for important spawning, nursery and feeding grounds at relevant times of year. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to aquaculture, the MSPACE report suggests that aquaculture vulnerability to climate change will be widespread around the UK. The report highlights that some areas in the East Marine Plan areas will exhibit some climate resilience, but only for some time. You might be able to make out a few white areas in figure 13, however it is fairly small, so sorry about that. But there are no consistent areas that are identified as future refugia. So in general, the East Marine Plan areas will be climate hotspots for both pelagic and benthic aquaculture. The East Inshore Marine area makes up a very large proportion of English shellfish, particularly mussel production via aquaculture, and as such identifying potential refugia areas, even if very small, we could potentially use this to safeguard aquaculture into the future, but we also recognise that the East Marine Plan area will be a large hotspot and therefore we may be able to develop policies that help alleviate pressures elsewhere. Please could I have the next slide? And then finally moving on to marine conservation. So the MSPACE output suggests that the East Marine Plan areas will be climate change hotspots for both seabed and open water habitats and species. So habitats overlap with designated sites and areas for potential restoration. As these sites are also subject to other pressures that will compound the problem, marine planning could look to safeguard areas from other pressures that will be adversely impacted by climate change. And marine planning will also consider how the MSPACE analysis ties in with other projects that are identifying priority sites for conservation and restoration in the East Marine Plan areas. MSPACE identified areas in the Central North Sea that are refugia for benthic habitats and prey species of interest to marine megafauna under RCP 4.5. However, RCP 8.5, these are actually considered to be hotspots. Refugio under RCP 4.5 occurs in areas with other pressures and overlap with some designated sites. Again, marine planning cannot designate MPAs, but we do have the ability to increase spatial support for MPAs, maybe in their ability to adapt to climate change, and also, again, look at other policies to reduce adverse impacts to refugia through the mitigation hierarchy. And then finally, looking at climate services, I touched on it a little bit earlier that there is a slight low confidence due to a lack of data on carbon sequestration, but the East Marine Plan areas are suggested to be refugia. Therefore, there is a potential to consider, as with kind of linking into other pieces of evidence that we have, which identifies will be priority habitats into the future. I feel at the moment the conservation outputs are slightly less clear cut, and I think Anna mentioned to me that we might be looking a bit more on RCP 4.5 scenarios moving forward. So we're really looking forward to working with MSPACE on the East case study to understand it further. Please can I have the next slide? So yeah, as I mentioned, this is very early stages, and the MMO recognises that there's numerous ways that we could interpret the outputs of the MSPACE reports, and they could be incorporated into planning moving forward. We will be considering MSPACE as evidence in the issues with supporting evidence stage of the East Marine Plan process, and from this, the MMO will seek to clarify what within the report can be addressed within marine planning. And yeah, we look forward to working with Anna and the team on the East Marine Plan case studies. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. Really another really nice talk. And once again, if people have questions, then please post them in the chat, and so that we can keep an eye on questions as we go. I'm going to hand over to our final presenter in this session, who's Hugh Edwards from DARA, who's again going to offer another user perspective. So over to you. Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that introduction. And yes, very opportunity to say a few words about the outputs of the MSPACE program from a Northern Ireland perspective. Firstly, I should say that I'm on the MSPACE steering group, and as part of that. I've been immensely impressed by the dedication and expertise of the whole MSPACE team, and you've a bit of that today. So thank you to the team for that. The photo that you can see here is you might recognize as a salmon farm. This is one of only 2 sites off the East Antrim coast of Northern Ireland. A site I'm well familiar with from various monitoring. The inset picture that you can see is the Mo Stinger Pelagica Noctiluca jellyfish, which wiped out the entirety pretty much of this salmon farm. I think both sites, 100,000 salmon, over £1 million worth in 2007. And I was part of the studies tracking those jellyfish. The relevance of that perhaps is that was put down at the time to having perhaps some influence of warming seas, of changes in prevailing winds and ocean currents. And it was also noted that what they would really want would be an early warning system for this. Now, I'm not sure the MSPACE early warning system quite would have the sort of rapid context that this would need, but just maybe shows you that there's definitely a need for early warning for all sorts of things. So yes, next slide.
Hugh, sorry, I'm just going to jump in very quickly. There are just a couple, well, a few users saying they can't actually hear you. I'm just checking to make sure it's all right at your end. I don't think it's everybody. I can hear you fine, but
okay,
if it's all right at your end, we'll just carry on. But just checking quickly.
I'll try and speak up a bit. Does that help? Maybe.
I suppose, yeah, I suppose that's all we can do. Yeah,
Okay.
It might just be 1 or 2 people. I can hear you absolutely fine. So sorry to interrupt and carry on. Right,
yeah,
thank you.
I hope people haven't missed too much there. Yes. So the MSPACE report has recognised, of course, that climate change is already affecting species and habitats in UK seas. We'd come to the same conclusion in Northern Ireland through various studies, but maybe wording things not quite as succinctly. We did a published paper in 2013 charting some of the declines and the declines in cold water species and increases in warmer water species. A few of them shown here, particularly of note, wasn't part of the study, but widely known in fisheries, that cod, formerly a very important catch in the Irish Sea, despite lots of current fisheries management measures, is going to struggle to recover because it is a cold water species. So that's one of concern. There's Pacific oysters shown here, bottom center. They're an important aquaculture species in Northern Ireland, and they have had several spawning events in Strangford Lough, again put down to climate change. So, and lastly to say on this slide, just bottom right, we also identified a refugia area, which fortunately maps up with a refugia area identified by the MSPACE programme. Although our mapping wouldn't have had the resolution of the MSPACE, what MSPACE has produced, but we did note from the species recorded that there were cold water species such as feather star that were hanging on in areas of Northern Ireland that you'll see in the maps in a moment. So yeah, next slide, please. So Northern Ireland area is a complex area, and as such, I'm very pleased that the MSPACE programme had a case study as part of you saw one of Anna's maps in her presentation there of some of the work done in Northern Ireland. So that's very reassuring. Hopefully it wasn't too complex for the team. Seems to have handled it very well, and I have a lot of faith in what's being produced. So you'll see on the image on the left there some of the habitats that are found around Northern Ireland, everything from soft muds to hard rock area and down to 270 meters. Also a number of fronts, different ocean systems. Again, a lot of complexity there. And also Forbes line here, which still is not far off where it stands at the moment, showing a line of a sort of north-south line between boreal cold water species, warm water, cold water species and Lusitanian warmer water species. So we're still pretty much sitting with that. It would be interesting to see whether that it needs to be remapped and where it would sit now. But the movements we've seen in Northern Ireland of species, colder water species disappearing and warmer water species coming in is probably, we're quite sensitive to that because we're sitting along that line for part of the Northern Ireland marine area. So next slide, please. Yes, mentioned complexity there. I'm very pleased that the MSPACE program have taken on looking at all the various scenarios and the most likely outcomes from those. We have a climate change policy in our draft marine plan for Northern Ireland. And we'll have a lot to consider from this, as will stakeholders in conservation NGOs, fisheries, aquaculture, anyone else with an interest in use of the sea. So I'm very pleased that again the discussion's been opened up by this programme, and that all the data and information is there for everyone to consider. Next slide, please. So you've seen this map already, just to show you the Northern Ireland element of it. We do have on the map on the right there, we do have a fairly significant refugee area running down the middle of the Irish Sea. It is a refugee area for quite a few sectors. So that's one thing we're going to have to consider, is that overlap. Yeah, that'll be a challenge for users of the area and for marine planning. So we're just really at the start of that journey. Also to note that that's, I think from the outputs, that's only really a refugee area until maybe 2040. So we'll also need to consider what happens beyond that as well. Next slide, please. So that's it really. That's just a little bit of an introduction to the Northern Ireland marine area, marine planning considerations in it, and the outputs of the programme. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. That was great, and a really good example, I think, of how engagement, this whole program has really been sort of co-designed, and it hasn't just brought in policy people at the back end of it like today to say, oh look, this is what the scientists have done, but we've worked with people like yourself, you and Sean and others all the way along, and I think what we're seeing today is the incredible strength in that approach, that if you work together with policymakers and industry and across sectors right up front, then you actually end up with a tool that is useful and is already being embedded into these policies. So really exciting to hear those user perspectives after Anna's technical summary. So I noticed we've had a few questions posted in the chat. I'm just going to refer to them briefly, even if they've been answered, just so everybody's aware that they're there. And then I'm happy if anybody wants to basically stick their hand up, and we can take other questions now. But while I'm waiting for people to do that, I'll just refer to the chat. So just to say, yes, we do intend to make the recording of this session and some of the materials, slides, etc., available after this. So yes, we will be in touch. So that will be there. I'm just going to read these also in case anybody wants to come back to them. There's a question from Sammy Rabella about the wind farm data, and obviously some of these things, it's a broader question really, because when we're going through the time slices and the modeling moving forward, and we're including some of this data, things will change as we go. So wind farms are are the classic thing. We don't exactly know where all the wind farms will be at this point and where the licenses will be. I didn't know whether you wanted, Anna, if you don't mind, if I kind of just come back to you on that one. Did you want to say a little bit about that? Because I thought that was quite an interesting question about wind farm data and the mapping. And
yes, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Samuel. So I sent a link to the report, which has very detailed information about what data we used. And I think Samuel's question was probably a difference between some of the plots, which might include areas which are licensed for wind, but where there is no operational wind farm. So it's that difference. So I just refer the users to the detail in the figures, which will identify those nuances and which are important in the interpretation of the results. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thanks, Hannah. That's great. And then once again, a few more questions around access to information and methodology. And yes, please go to the links in the chat. There was a question once again. I know, just I'll throw this back to you in a minute, because there was a question about the online interactive map for the refuges and hotspots, etc. And you have pointed out that this will come into the sort of MSPACE, the next stage. So Anna, once again, it might be as we've got a couple of minutes, say a little bit more about MSPACE and how that's going to develop and what the outputs will be from that.
Sure. So this, thanks for the question. So what we showed, the early warning system, is an important delivery of the MSPACE project, but it's only the starting point, which was really about enabling colleagues like Sean and Hugh, who so kindly outlined as users, how it was really about increasing the access of users such as them and other planners around the UK to have access to climate evidence and to be able and to access it in a format that is useful to the planning process, as well as to help support stakeholder consultations, which are such an inherent part of the planning process. But that's only the starting point. So what MSPACE has done is actually create a broader decision support system, which I alluded to in my presentation, which also takes into account how acting on this type of evidence may or may not have potential impacts in the economy of the areas adjacent to the planning area. So, for example, in the case of the marine plan for Northern Ireland, that would be the Northern Ireland economy. But in other subnational planning contexts, for example, the East Marine Plan, that it's more about that specific region of England. And so, what we've also done a lot of work on, and some of our colleagues involved in this work are here, is about exploring the use of that data in alternative spatial management scenarios that look at the climate evidence as well as those economic repercussions and translate them into indicators that those stakeholders might find more tangible, like numbers of jobs, the particular revenue of a given sector, and take into account as well how the people in those regions, the people in the marine sectors affected by those plans perceive the marine environment and different aspects of the marine environment. So that decision support system is used within MSPACE to create the final project recommendations around the scenario development. And I showed you an example of one of the scenarios for Northern Ireland that we have been developing. But it was really important for us that capability didn't end with the lifetime of the project. So this is a research program which is co-delivered but has, you know, a 4-year lifetime. And we found it really important that that decision support system was available after the lifetime of the project. And that's the MSPACE tool that I mentioned, that Matt mentioned just now. And that tool is a web-based AI-assisted version of the decision support system we developed, which we are creating now. And that becomes available free for use at the end of summer next year, so summer 2025. So if you're interested in that, we're going to have a series of workshops which will lead to the co-development of the tool, starting from around the middle of this summer. And so if you're interested in the tool, and which will allow that interactive exploration, not just of the climate evidence, but also the economic evidence and the values evidence, and will also be able to take on not just the data that we created through the program, but user data. So if you're interested in that development, please get in touch with us, and we'd love to chat to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Susanna, if I've missed anything in the chat, let me know. But otherwise, does anybody else have any questions they would like to ask either to Anna or the other speakers? If not, I'm going to throw in a quick question and take chairman's privilege. Okay, I can't see any hands raised. So, Anna, if you could, just one other question. I mean, obviously, you and I have worked quite closely on this, and with MCCIP as well. There's a lot of interest. I mean, and a lot of interest in this, not just across the UK, but we found interest in this. Well, it's no exaggeration, say across the globe. There are lots of people who've seen this work, seen the potential for this work to be rolled out. You know, we're looking at the UK overseas territories, but also we've been approached by lots of other people working in different parts of the world. Did you want to just say a little bit about how you could see that working? Because, you know, there are people who want to use this all over the place, but there's so much work that's had to go into getting this in place for the UK. So maybe you want to just comment briefly on how you could see this potentially being rolled out more broadly.
Sure, thanks, Matt. So we are very privileged in the UK to have this capability, not just in terms of the modeling, but also the social sciences and the type of economic data we have for our nations and for our regions. So we are quite privileged in our ability to make that transformative change in terms of climate adaptive policy for marine space. And of course, that's not the case in every region of the world. As Matt says, it is indeed a global aspiration to have climate smart approaches to planning and spatial management in general for the marine environment. And that's recognized both well across the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, for example, that has its own program dedicated for, and led by UNESCO, focusing on this particular theme. So it is indeed true that we have had interest from colleagues around the world in these types of applications for their region. One of the projects we have at the moment, for example, which is led by Paul here from MCCIP, Paul Buckley, is indeed exploring the application of these types of approaches in the UK overseas territories. And we've had experience in the team working in different areas of the world where there are different degrees of capability when it comes to elaborating climate adaptive policy. Again, not just in terms of climate modeling, but also in the social sciences. How do we measure that? How do we measure people's attitudes toward the marine environment to create buy-in, social license for these types of approaches? And so there is indeed not one solution that fits all, and working with that context and starting from the point where we started as well in MSPACE, which is about reaching out to those who have responsibility for making those decisions and understanding what is their ambition, what is their particular mechanism that they have, which is really the approach of MSPACE, to try and understand that very specific context within which planning develops. As you could hear from Sean and from Hugh's approach, really, different areas of the UK, different nations have very different approaches. And so when we talk around the world, that becomes even more complex and more different. So the approach is always to listen, to try and understand what is the specific mechanism within which planning develops in that particular region or nation, and then reaching out to the local partners to understand what access do they already have or don't have to climate evidence and the type of social evidence, economic evidence that we were discussing earlier, and then working within that to create that pathway. And what I would say is that the most important part is really the co-deliveries, making sure that it is an actionable recommendation that the project is making, and that only happens if we work with the end users from the time when we're writing these proposals, which is what we did with this project. So that would be my 2 cents on that, Matt. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And sorry for putting you on the spot there, but yeah, no, that's fantastic. So I think we're coming to the end of the Q&A now. That we'll save obviously all the questions and answers, and if there's any others at the last second, put them in there so we can get back to you. So just before we have a final word on next steps, I'd just like to really thank first of all of you for coming, because it is kind of lunchtime and we're all jumping meeting to meeting. So thank you so much for coming and engaging. And obviously thank you to Anna and to Hugh and to Sean, 3 really fantastic talks. And thank you for Paul and Susanna as well for putting all this together. So just as we finish, I'm going to hand over to Anna just for one last word, if on anything we haven't covered on next steps. Over to you, Anna.
Matt, sorry to butt in. There is one more question in the chat if you want to take that.
If we've got time, let me have a look and see if it's one we can answer quickly.
I think I will. I think the question is around the work we're doing in terms of functional areas, in terms of the seaward and the landward areas. And indeed, no, we do not cover intertidal habitats, only fully submerged habitats. I think that's the answer, but I'm happy to follow through with Tanya offline.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Paul. Okay, Anna, did you want to? Is there anything to say very quickly on next steps, and then?
Yeah, just leaving the contact point. So if you are interested in being part of this dialogue, if it's something that's useful to your agency or your sector, we are having a series of workshops for the development of the MSPACE tool, and we are very interested in hearing from different perspectives involved in planning. So if you're interested, please reach out to me or via Twitter, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
That's great. Thank you. So yes, so as I said, you should have got there the contacts. When we send out the information after this meeting, we'll make sure everything's included. So you've got contact details, both for Anna to contact directly regarding the MSPACE, and if you're interested more broadly in any of the work MCCIP are doing, please contact Paul and myself here as well, and we can put you in touch. So that's it. We're just in time to finish. So yeah. And thank you to everybody. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to onward working together as we move forward. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.